Really, really thrilled to be joined by Mayor Abdullah Hammoud. Abdullah Hammoud has been the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan since January 2021. He has 3 degrees from the University of Michigan, a proud son of immigrants, and he lives in Dearborn with his wife, who is a doctor, and must be an extraordinarily busy guy these days. So, Mayor Hammoud, I'm really grateful that you joined us.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Um,
And with
so
those 3 degrees comes a lot of student debt, just FYI.
um, as always, I'm going to ask questions, but people should put questions in the chat and I'll convey some of those as well. So I imagine the question that you get asked 100 times a day these days is the one that I'll start with too, which is, what is the conversation that you're hearing in Dearborn, especially among Arab Americans, about the question of whether Kamala Harris is doing enough to motivate people to come out and vote for her?
I think to open it up, it's important that the immediate conversation I have with residents is just the personal experience and the toll of what's unfolding in Gaza has on their lives. I mean, many of my residents have lost dozens of family members in Gaza over the last 10 months now. And so many are horrified at the images and videos that have emerged. And as it pertains to the context of the election in 80 days now, folks are seeing that there's a softening of tone, there's a shift in rhetoric. But really, more than anything, they want to see that tough rhetoric paired with tough policy. And I think that is what is yet to be seen from the vice president's team. And so I think they would love to see a presidential candidate who aligns with their values and principles, who understand that what's happening in Gaza needs to end, that you have to have access to humanitarian aid. You want to bring home all the hostages and prisoners through a ceasefire. And ultimately, you want to establish a just Palestinian state, because the return to status quo is not only impossible, but it's just no longer feasible. I mean, that situation has to change. And so I think these are the talking points and the conversations that I'm having with many constituents here.
And do you feel like the Harris campaign is listening? Do you feel like they understand the depth of the anger and the pain that a lot of folks have felt about the war?
I don't think there's anybody who does not understand the depth of the anger and the feelings of betrayal, frankly, that occurred for many at this point in time. You're talking 10 months in, whether you're looking at the health ministry numbers or the Lancet numbers, anywhere from 40,000 to 200,000 people killed, 100% of the population displaced, 90% of civilian infrastructure decimated. And so I don't think anybody has an excuse to say that they don't understand the fear or the hurt or the pain of the community. I know that reading the tea leaves, reading the media, on social and such, there are many conversations happening between Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, the broader uncommitted movement, the pro-justice movement, with the campaign teams. And so I do know there are conversations being had. I think we'll see what happens at the DNC convention, and then obviously what unfolds between now and November.
You mentioned the DNC. What are the scale of the kind of protests that you expect that we'll see next week?
I'm not immediately attached to what's happening at the DNC. I myself more than likely will not be able to be in attendance. I know the uncommitted campaign, obviously I was one of the spokespeople here in the state of Michigan, but really it's being spearheaded by Abbas, Layla, and Lexi, and I leave it to them to determine what the organizing is. I know there's a large Palestinian community, obviously, in the Chicago area, where you do have the convention taking place, and there might be some organizers happening. But I also believe in a formal way, you're going to see some panels formed and potential speakers on the issue of Gaza from the Muslim American community or the Arab American community. And I think if they have the ability to take center stage, you can at least give context and narrative to demonstrate that we too are a part of the fabric of America. And so I think that begins next week. And so we'll see what happens.
You talked about Arab and Muslim Americans being part of the fabric of America. Maybe for people who are not so familiar with Dearborn, maybe you could just talk a little bit about the history of the city and how it became a place that so many Arab and Muslim Americans came to, what the different waves of immigration from different places were.
Well, Dearborn is the greatest city in America. If you're not living here, you're missing out. But my parents immigrated here. My mother in 1974, she was 4 years old, left the Lebanese civil war that was unfolding. My father came here in the early 80s, Lebanese as well. And he got a job, basically driving truck for an auto adjacent job, delivering steel for the auto manufacturers. And so for many Arab Americans, they first came over to get a job for Henry Ford. Dearborn's obviously the home of Ford Motor Company, or to get a job with one of the big three auto manufacturers or an auto adjacent job. And that's really what led to the spur of migration. And so I often tell folk that between manufacturing as one pathway, I would also add and be remiss if I didn't say, oftentimes the migration was a result of poor foreign policy decision making. And so when you had the Iraq War, the war in Yemen, and others, you saw migrations from those communities to the city of Dearborn because Dearborn was saw as a welcoming community. And so Dearborn has been home to many migrant communities and really that gateway, whether it was the Polish, the Italians, the Lebanese, Yemeni Americans, and so on. And so it's the fastest growing city in the state of Michigan, home of Ford Motor Company, home of a flourishing small business economy as well. And there's no place like it. We have a historic road called Alter Road. And on Alter Road, you have the country's largest mosque surrounded by three churches. And they share the same sidewalks, same parking lots. And so we have a very strong interfaith community here as well. And it's extremely beautiful.
And I know that there was a time when a lot of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans voted Republican. I remember going back to in the 2000 presidential campaign. You're too young to remember that, but I mean, I remember that the Bush campaign really was making an effort to lure Arab and Muslim Americans and felt like there was a strong connection to the Republican Party. What would you say is the kind of conversation that you hear in Dearborn about the relationship between the two political parties and the community?
Arab Americans largely flipped in Bush's second term post the Iraq War. And I think for many, they recognize over the last 20 years, the Arab Americans, Muslim Americans have been a very strong Democratic voting base. Also because of alignment with union rights, workers' rights, jobs that our family ultimately landed in over the last several decades. And I think right now the conversation many are having is, where do we belong? We want to see presidential candidates who fight for the values that we believe in. And oftentimes people will say is for the last 20 years, we've kind of set aside foreign and global issues as secondary. We obviously didn't vote for presidential candidates based on their standing of Gaza or Lebanon or Syria or Yemen and so on and so forth, because they've always been secondary. We haven't really found alignment with non-interventionalists. And I think the message we try to communicate is that we care just as much about universal healthcare as we care about what's unfolding in Gaza. We care just as much about ensuring we have a green future as much as we care about what's unfolding in Lebanon. That just because we had the privilege and opportunity to come to America for financial freedom, for future opportunities, and we had to bid farewell to our loved ones back home, it does not mean that we do not want for our loved ones what we want for ourselves. So I think there's a lot of conversation swirling. And I'm really interested to see what happens this November. I think I can tell you on the down ballot, though, what's also happened over the last several decades is you see many Arab Americans and Muslim Americans assuming office. And they tend to assume office, aligning themselves to the Democratic Party or being Democratic Party affiliated. And so there has been a more welcoming nature of the Democratic Party, but oftentimes still feel alienated in some capacity.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. I imagine it's not been easy for Arab and Muslim American politicians who want to ascend and run for state house or for the U.S. Congress or for governor or whatever, given going all the way back to September 11th and beyond, given the fact that there's a lot of hostility that still exists in the public culture. I'm just curious what your experience has been like as an aspiring politician who is Arab American, what that experience is like.
I can tell you when I first approached my parents in end of 2015 that I was planning on running for state representative. My father told me in Arabic, Abdullah, which means, did you forget that your name is Abdullah? Meaning that nobody would accept a person like Abdullah to run for such a position. And my mother reminded me of why we came to America to begin with, because of political strife. And now I'm trying to voluntarily enter the political realm. But I did so with a name like Abdullah Hussein Hammoud. It hasn't always been easy to navigate. When I was a state rep, I obviously ran as a Democrat. What I often found in my caucus sometimes is folks don't know how to navigate issues that impact Muslim Americans or Arab Americans. And they say, great, we'll just let the Arab American and Muslim American lead, and we don't really have to speak up. We'll let that individual speak up. But I think if there's anything to be learned, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or what have you, the bridges we build between one another are what make our community stronger, so that we're all there for one another. And I think that's what folks try to do when they run for office, especially Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. I myself was a member of the Black Caucus in the State House. The caucus was welcoming to all non-white members. I was the first Muslim within that Black Caucus. So it's been a great experience thus far. In my mayor position, I'm in a nonpartisan role. And so it makes it a little different of an election cycle. But those are the conversations that you tend to have. You have to build those bridges, to build coalitions, because you can't rely on just people of the same background, faith, ethnicity, and such to also get into office. You have to win the votes of constituents of all backgrounds.
Yeah. What do you think is going to be the long-term impact on Arab and Muslim American political organizing of this post-October 7th Gaza war environment and this sense of deep alienation from what the Biden administration has done?
I think what you find is within the Arab American, Muslim American community, broadly speaking, they're looking to each candidate on an individual by individual basis and assessing them for where they stand. This is a community that backed Bernie Sanders twice in his presidential bid, that backed Andy Levin when he ran for Congress because of his non-interventionalist philosophy as it pertains to foreign issues. I think that's really the long-term impact. I'm not having conversations with folks who are flocking to the Republican Party who wanted to vote for Trump. I don't hear that at all. In fact, I have many conservative friends and family members who are not voting for Trump whatsoever because they understand what he stands for. And so I think it really is going to be a candidate by candidate evaluation. I think what has shocked many over the last 10 months, especially with the uncommitted movement that blossomed out of the city of Dearborn, is that this is a community that's willing to put people first. Oftentimes, it's a talking point that many speak to, but nobody actually musters the backbone to do so. And so we're willing to put people over party and people over president. And I think that has been strange to many to accept, although an ideal that I would bet Americans across the country want in their own elected officials.
Right. And what has this period been like in terms of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim discrimination and bigotry? I mean, I've read things since October 7th that have described this period compared to the post 9/11 period. How difficult has it been in terms of backlash against Arab Muslim America?
I grew up in the post 9/11 era. And I would tell you, I was 11 at that time. I had a gun pulled on me the day after 9/11 as I was walking home. And a man decided to say, keep walking before I decide to shoot you Muslim kids. And I would say that this is a more difficult time as a father of two. And I think the social media and the proliferation of social media has made it a little bit more difficult. If you just search Dearborn on social media and you see what comes up, you see that Dearborn's often the target of a lot of vitriol, a lot of bigotry, anti-Arab, Islamophobia. And we also know that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are linked, that oftentimes they're climbing together because people tend to target minority communities across the board collectively, because the most radical thing is actually willful ignorance. And that's proliferating across the board, and social media has given it room to proliferate. And so the beauty of Dearborn is we're a very close-knit community. Again, it's a city of 110,000, seventh largest city, but it has a very much a small town feel. And everyone here, regardless of background, really looks out for one another, where your neighbors grow to be friends and family, there for you in moments of joy and there for you in moments of grief. And I think that's the beauty of the city of Dearborn.
You mentioned Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. I wonder to what degree it has been possible to work with the organized Jewish community in Michigan, or any elements of the Jewish community in Michigan. As you say, there's a common white nationalism of the kind of Trump variety, I think clearly threatens both Arabs and Muslims. And yet, of course, many in the organized American Jewish community on Israel are in a very, very different place than I think many of your constituents. So I wonder what that's been like.
At the core of the uncommitted movement has obviously been the Jewish Forces for Peace. And I can tell you that every single day, many of us communicate together in social media channels, via Signal, or whatever group chats we have, about what we're facing in our communities, what lessons we can share, how we can help uplift and support one another, ensuring voices are elevated. And so there has to be continuous dialogue. And as I said, Dearborn has a very strong interfaith community led by the various preachers of all backgrounds and faiths. And so they come together and they coalesce and work together about what the speeches are happening during congregations, whether they be on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, to make sure that we all echo the same sentiment that we have to stand by one another through these most difficult moments.
And I'm sure people often ask you just straight out, what should I do in this election? I imagine people say things like, I really obviously don't want Trump to come back, but I feel like it would be really hard to vote for the vice president in an administration that has done what it's done during the war in Gaza. Should I vote for a third-party candidate? So how do you help people with that question?
Yeah, I do my best to not assist them with that question at this time. You have 80 days until the election. If we've learned anything with this presidential election cycle, you don't know what's going to happen one day from now, let alone later today. And so I think the best is, there's a lot of time between now and November, and we need to be patient and listen. I think more than anything, what I'm hearing from residents is they want to be inspired to come out to cast their ballot come November. And that hope and inspiration is what drives people to the polls. If we look at the August primary that just happened in Michigan, you saw a very low voter turnout. And as a reminder, back in 2016, it wasn't people coming out in droves voting for Donald Trump that led to Trump ascending to the president, to the White House. In fact, it was 80,000 people that skipped the presidential question on the ballot that led Trump to ascend to the White House. And so apathy is dangerous in this context. And so what I'm trying to communicate to folks is, regardless of how you feel, make a plan to vote. If there's anything I am endorsing, is I am endorsing you to go to that ballot box and to vote. And at that point in time, between now and then, we can have the conversation in a meaningful way, hopefully, who to vote for. If you're not sure about where to vote for president, are you looking at the U.S. Senate race? Because that's still important. If you're not looking at the U.S. Senate race, are you looking at your congressional delegate? Are you looking at some of the down ballot races? Because obviously local politics also matters in this context. And so I'm trying to have many conversations in a multidimensional way about the importance of voting. And even if you feel apathy about the presidential question, there are still so many questions on that ballot that still need your participation.
And when you look at the Senate race or other non-races, are you seeing anything which is more hopeful in terms of a different position on the war than you're getting from Democrats at the national level?
I can't say in Michigan that the position on Gaza has been a hopeful one. I think there's kind of been gridlock and a lack of movement on this front, which is why you've seen a greater level of apathy. I really hope that folk understand the context that, the idea of folk wanting a ceasefire as the only means to bring home the hostages and prisoners, that's the only means of allowing unfettered humanitarian aid coming in. Whether you're talking about offensive arms embargo, whether you're talking about a just Palestinian state, these are issues that are popular amongst Americans from coast to coast. The majority of Democrats believe in a ceasefire. Of independents and Republicans all want a ceasefire to come into place. And so I just hope that our elected officials are not taking positions because of political expediency, which oftentimes they do. And what I really hope is that they heed the concerns of the constituents they're trying to represent, especially those seeking the White House, the highest office in the world. Heed the concerns of the Americans from coast to coast, because the issues that I'm speaking to, these are popular issues and positions from Americans, not only of Arab descent or of Muslim faith, but of various multi-faith, multi-generational backgrounds. And that was what created the uncommitted movement. You had 110,000 people vote for uncommitted in the state of Michigan. And 73 of 83 counties, uncommitted achieved 10% of the vote. That's not because Arabs and Muslims are in 73 counties to that capacity. It's because it was a multi-generational, multi-faith, multi-ethnic coalition that came together organically, and the message resonated.
Harris's foreign policy advisor, Phil Gordon, put out a statement, I guess it was last week, saying that they did not support an arms embargo. So it seems to me it would be unlikely they would walk that back, given that they said it explicitly. Are there things short of an arms embargo that you think would be meaningful to people in terms of how they see Kamala Harris on this issue?
The community is not a monolith, and I obviously can't speak for everyone. I can tell you that based on the conversations that I've had, many people have varying viewpoints on this, right? There are some who really want somebody to be firm in their position on a ceasefire and what they'll do to achieve that ceasefire. That's how they expressly look at this. You have others who are obviously speaking to the offensive arms embargo, about holding Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir accountable to achieve this ceasefire. You have others who say, listen, all this set aside, ultimately we have to talk about how we never come back to this place again. And the only way to get there is by achieving a just Palestinian state. So what is her position on a Palestinian state, along what lines and what way and in what timeline? And so I don't think there's a singular answer that I can give you right now, more than people are in listening mode. I think I read that, somebody commented in that fashion. I think that makes a lot of sense. People are listening. Had the door closed with President Biden, the door's cracked open with Vice President Harris, and people are wondering, how will she differentiate herself on this issue in the long term? And so I saw Dr. Gordon's tweets. I obviously don't agree with it in many ways, but I'm really hopeful that there's nuance to these conversations, that it can change. And I think what you also brought up that's really important is the folks that surround Vice President Harris are just as important, because they will help usher and lead the policy decisions that are being made each and every single day.
Yeah. How much of a presence do you see in Dearborn for the campaigns of the third-party candidates who are like a Jill Stein or Cornel West? Do you feel like they're making inroads?
There's certainly folk who are, given the candidates have called for a ceasefire early on, who are speaking to the genocide as it's unfolding. There's obviously an appeal to many pro-justice, anti-war constituencies. In terms of actual presence in the community, I can't tell you I've driven by and seen lawn signs yet. It is only August. Lawn signs are a very big deal in the city of Dearborn, but I imagine as you get closer to October, you'll see these lawn signs prop up. I think right now, a lot of the presidential campaigns are just reaching out to various constituencies, having conversations, largely leading through a social media means. And so we'll see what happens between now and then. Again, it's 80 days. It's a lot that's happened in the last 20 days, 30 days. Pretty much it's a world away between now and November. And there's a lot that can happen in that lifetime.
Hmm. Is there any outreach from the Republican Party, from the Trump campaign in Dearborn, or they just basically kind of ignore Arab and Muslim?
No, I know that there are conversations happening between the Republican campaign and some Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. Outreach is occurring. It always has occurred, even before this election cycle. What I can tell you again, though, is I don't think any of it's working or connecting. Folks understand what a Trump presidency represents. We saw it when he was in office. We saw that Trump had moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Trump recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights. Trump ended all humanitarian aid for Palestinians. Trump provided the arms to Saudi Arabia, which led to the killing of over 30,000 people in Yemen. Trump ushered the Muslim ban, is talking about ushering it again. Trump throws around the word Palestinian as a slur. Right. And so people are not fooled by this. And again, even my conservative friends and family members are not fooled by this. And so Trump and his team, his son-in-law, talk about Gaza waterfront property, through that lens of just economic development opportunity for those who want to put more money into their pockets. And so again, the message is not connecting. The folks you're speaking to do not represent or reflect the leadership of the Arab American and Muslim American community. So I don't think it'll work.
Yeah. The polling that I've seen suggests that Michigan is right now maybe essentially tied. I've seen some polls showing that maybe Kamala Harris has a lead of a couple points. I'm just curious, as someone who's there and is in politics and has your finger on the pulse, if the election were held today in Michigan, what does your gut say would happen?
My personal belief, based on what I'm seeing and feeling and hearing, I think that the polls that show Vice President Harris up a few points probably make sense. I think there's a renewed energy amongst many Democrats. I think I saw a poll that like some 80+% of Democrats are now excited to come out and vote in November, which was plus 40 from where it was when President Biden was at the top of the ticket. But again, a long time between now and November, and typically you know that these races get tight around November. It really is all within the margin of error. You don't know what happens. I think ultimately what is clear is those who turn out their base, those who are able to build their coalition, are the ones who end up winning. And I think for Vice President Harris, the challenge she has before her is rebuilding and reuniting the coalition to help topple Trump in the first place, to help give her the edge in the victory this November. And I think what folks are looking for is her rhetoric to align with the policy that she puts forward.
Yeah. And do you think that her campaign is well organized in the state? Do you have a sense of that yet?
I would be speaking on something that I don't know much about right now. She's had, maybe 30 days now, if that, to pull together a campaign. And so I think Lavora Barnes, who's the head of the Michigan Democratic Party here, has been very organized and successful. And so I think allowing the locals to do what they do best, I think you can count on them.
Yeah. You mentioned Dearborn being the headquarters of Ford Motor Company, and obviously organized labor is an important force in Michigan. We have a question about just a sense of what you think their role is going to be in this campaign, and also how open folks in organized labor have been to the concerns that you're expressing about the war in Gaza.
Labor has been very organized and very aligned with the concerns of the community. Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, is one of the first to call for a ceasefire, such a prominent role within labor. And he's built a coalition of labor who have all called for an arms embargo. No more weapons to Netanyahu, or not another bomb. And so I think labor is very much in tune and in alignment with where the people are. This is not the first time. Labor has a strong history of being opposed to the wars abroad. And so it falls very much in line with where they are. And Dearborn's obviously the home to Local 600, one of the largest locals in the state and in the country, which we're proud of. So with that rich history, they're very much organizing together and aligning the interests and values together.
Someone in the chat was mentioning Rashida Tlaib. When you talk to people who look at what she represents, but also what she's gone through and what she's endured in Congress, does that make people say, yeah, I want to follow in her path? Or does it make people feel like, gosh, being a Palestinian American who's vocal about Palestinian rights with such hell to pay that I don't want any part of that?
Rashida has it a million times more difficult than I do. She's obviously Palestinian. She has family in Gaza and Palestine. And she has been a North Star in Congress with the stance that she has on this issue and the position that she's taken. And you obviously see all the vitriol, the bigotry that comes her way. And so in one sense, the community is unified in ensuring that we uplift Congresswoman Tlaib and Rashida. In another sense, people are also taken aback at how much crap she is given for speaking what we believe to know, truth to power. So the community that you build around yourself and ensuring that you uplift your elected officials is extremely important, which is why I said, come this November, the message we have to residents is make sure you go out and vote for those down ballot races to demonstrate your support, even if they are unopposed, even if they don't have a strong competition against them. You still want to be vocal through your vote about the importance of the position that they have taken.
Right. You mentioned Bernie Sanders. Why was it that Bernie Sanders had so much appeal? Was it mostly just his foreign policy views, or were there other aspects of his persona that were really appealing to folks?
Senators, or as we call them in Dearborn, Uncle Bernie. For one, I want to say that the mere fact that he was of Jewish faith, he had a stronger affinity to connect with the folks in Dearborn. And obviously, his policy positions that he had were universally aligned with the values that the various constituencies in here in Dearborn have. So, foreign policy agenda is one, but also the way, if you look at Bernie's speeches over the decades he has served in elected office, you can almost play them at any given time without the video, and he hasn't changed. The man is a force when it comes down to the values that he has taken a stand on. And I think that is what resonated with a lot of folks. That this wasn't somebody who was going to be corrupted once he assumed the White House. This is an individual that has been steadfast and speaking to the same points for decades now. And so there was a strong confidence about what he would stand for once he assumed that office. And so whether it was universal health care, supporting and uplifting small businesses, ending corporate greed, holding polluters accountable, making sure we have a green future, ending the interventionalism that has often been exported by us through the means of weapons transfers and weapons sales. These are the things that align with folks. And he united conservative factions, liberal factions, independent factions all together to align behind him. And so it was a presidency that could have been.
Yeah.
And I have time for one more question.
Oh, sure. Okay. The last question I guess I would just ask is, since a lot of people in Dearborn have a connection to the Middle East, have family there, what do you think it is that they understand about American foreign policy in the Middle East that many other Americans don't understand?
I appreciate you asking this question. We know what it's like on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I have residents who can tell you what it's like to have an IDF boot stomped on their face. I have residents who have dug up their grandmothers from under the rubble after the residential tower has been bombed by IDF fighter jet. I have residents who still have their booklets from when they lived under occupation in Palestine or Lebanon, where IDF soldiers had to stamp in order to give them the freedom to move around in their own ancestral village. And so for us, it's extremely personal, and we have those scars, be they physical or emotional, of what it was like to live under that context. And so when we see the videos and images, we don't have to imagine what it's like. Many of us have lived those circumstances. And so that's why when we had the opportunity to make it to America, whether us or our parents or our grandparents, what we promised to ourselves is to not forget about those who did not have the luxury of escaping their living conditions. And that's why these issues are so important to us. And that's why I often communicate to people, yes, we care about Gaza, and you've heard a lot of us talk about Gaza, but we also care about universal healthcare. We care about Lebanon, but we also care about workers' rights and unions' rights. And that for us, the values that we uplift and uphold, they're universal. They go beyond any geographic border that has been created, because the things that we want for our families here, we also want for our families abroad.
Mayor Hammoud, thank you very, very much for being with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So this is a bit shorter than our usual calls. Next week, our guest is going to be Joshua Leifer, who's a really excellent journalist writing about Israel and Palestine and also about American politics, and has a new book just out called Tablet Shattered. I read most of it. It's probably the best book that's come out in many years about American Jewish politics. It's a really, really smart, interesting history and argument. So that'll be next Friday at 11. And also, we're starting a new feature for premium members, which is going to be a monthly open conversation, ask me anything call for people who are premium members. That costs a little bit more, but I think we're going to start it near the end of this month. We'll announce the date on Monday. And of course, we'll keep doing these ones on Friday as well. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.